Hello, my name is Cecilia from the NYDA team, and you are listening to the NYDA podcast. We conduct due diligence and monitoring of working conditions using worker engagement technologies. And on this third season of this podcast, we want to support procurement and sustainability professionals with powerful insights relating to human rights due diligence. What are the legal requirements when considered practically, and what would constitute good practice? We bring you some of the leading voices in this field to answer these important questions. Come and join us. Hello. Thank you so much for joining us today on another special edition of the NYDA podcast. As mentioned in our intro, this season of the NYDA podcast is focused on human rights due diligence and how to support procurement and sustainability professionals with truly embedding the 6 elements as put forward in the OECD due diligence guidelines. So today, our guest is another friend of NYDA, a returning guest and a cherished partner to NYDA, Madeleine Koalick, who together with Gwendolyn Remit, founded Sustainable Links, which is a German-based consultancy which supports companies to embed the social dimension of sustainability in their business activities and to positively shape their impact on people and society. Madeleine brings extensive experience on corporate due diligence across many sectors, and she will be in conversation with Lee Esterhazen. Hello, Lee, who is, of course, the CEO and founder of NYDA. Lee is also a data scientist and research methodologist who has been designing systems to gather sensitive data for more than 2 decades now. And so myself and my teammates all get to be part of the mission of NYDA, which is to measure and improve working conditions across global supply chains using the power of listening. So thank you to the both of you for being on the podcast today. Hello.
Hello. Thank you. Thank you for having me again.
Lovely to have you, Madeleine. I mean, when we were speaking earlier, I was shocked that it's been almost 2 years now, actually, when we last spoke and when, Sustainable Links has been up and running. So, it's been so great to witness your impact and, of course, the work we've been doing together as businesses. Thank you so much for joining us again. So our topic today will mainly revolve around the German law, which has triggered widespread reactions, the due diligence law, and the first requirement under that supply chain law and the OECD guidelines as well is to embed proper due diligence policies and systems in a company. So, Madeleine, I'll direct this question to you, particularly as, having a consultancy based in the German landscape. If we did approach Sustainable Links for support with getting started with conducting proper due diligence as per the German supply chain law, where would you advise us to start?
We would definitely advise you to start with understanding where you stand currently, understanding your existing processes and any gaps you have with regards to proactive due diligence. We would encourage you to start to set up your risk management and also acknowledge that you're not starting from scratch as a company. You do have measures you're taking in many aspects of your business. It might be around your security measures, health and safety measures, your HR processes. All those parts of the business do touch on human rights due diligence and do fulfill parts of the requirements of human rights due diligence. So really getting to know what they're doing, understand them, see the full landscape, and then work through the requirements and adapt your existing systems is what we would encourage you to do.
Yeah, thank you for that. I love what you said about, you're not starting from scratch. So actually acknowledge the things that are already there. So what would you say then is missing from the legislative framework, which could make due diligence more impactful?
Well, in general, it's good that the law is, broad and offering a lot of, new challenges also for companies to focus on this topic. But what the law is a bit silent about is, for example, the aspect of engaging with affected rights holders, engaging with stakeholders as part of your human rights due diligence. And that does not only include internal stakeholders, but also external stakeholders. In the German law, for example, there's just under risk assessment, there's a reference to ensuring that the interests of those affected are considered in your measures, but it's not really a strong strong requirement in the law to do that. But in our view, engaging with potentially affected groups, engaging with stakeholders is what really makes your due diligence measures effective in the end, and what ensures that they really meet the needs of people. So I would have loved to see a bit more commitment to that, also from the in the legal framework.
It's interesting, tied to the point of embedding kind of human rights due diligence in your organization. It's the kind of quite broad, kind of loose reference to considering the interests of those affected doesn't quite get to the extent of needing to engage, internally, and engage fully in that literacy kind of process internally, right up to C-level, and ensure that they not just understand but support the kind of vision and purpose and benefits of human rights due diligence, but also, of course, also considering the interests of those affected, i.e. the rights holders, i.e. workers along the supply chain, etc. But just to Madeleine's point, is the joy of due diligence is that it can be as impactful internally as it can be externally, if it's done properly. And wouldn't it be a joy if we literally start with that embedding process, with starting to engage kind of deeply with stakeholders?
No, I absolutely agree. I mean, this is what often also what companies underestimate when they start this journey, how much engagement it also needs internally to really embed due diligence in the organization. Often companies think this is more of a technical requirement. We need to maybe buy a risk tool here, and then maybe we need to write a compliance-based policy there. But in the end, what due diligence wants you to do is to know your impact and act on your impact and make sure that you address any risks that you have. And this requires people across the organization, also in your environment, to know, to be able to get in touch with you, to contact you, and to together to find the right answers, the right responses to risks. And in the end, you need quite good engagement professionals within the business to make that happen.
So Madeleine, you've actually contributed to a recent publication for the Global Compact Network Germany that kind of dives into this topic of meaningful stakeholder engagement. So how would you define that, and where would you say that fits into human rights due diligence specifically?
Mm-hmm. Yes, we've worked with the Global Compact Network Germany on an insights publication on what makes stakeholder engagement meaningful, because this word meaningful is mentioned in the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights. It talks about meaningful stakeholder engagement as a requirement for due diligence. So that's where the term comes from, and we wanted to define a bit more what this could mean. And in the end, for me, meaningful engagement means that you get a result, an impact, or a positive result for those affected. It's not just engagement for the sake of engagement, but it is linked to a clear change, to a clear outcome that improves the situation. And this means it makes sense both for the business, because it makes sense within the context of your due diligence. It makes your due diligence better, and it makes sense for the rights holders, for those affected, for the stakeholders consulted. So if both things are met, then for me this defines meaningful engagement. And basically, engagement is important for many of the elements in the due diligence process. Basically for all of the elements of the due diligence process. Maybe especially important for identifying your risks and impacts, because who knows best that they are at risk? I mean, it's the affected groups that might be harmed that know best if something presents a risk to them. Then I think the second point to highlight would be prevention and mitigation measures. because again, how do you know that you're creating effective measures in response to risk? Only if the affected groups are better off or feel that this prevention has worked and the situation has improved. And the same also in the field of grievance mechanisms. We often have those discussions with companies. What does accessible mean? In the end, accessible grievance mechanism means that your rights holders, your stakeholders can access this mechanism. So they need to judge what is an accessible mechanism. Do they feel comfortable using it? Are they able to use it? Do they have the means to use it? All of that can, of course, be improved by directly engaging with the users of these mechanisms, for example. And then I think an aspect that is often underdeveloped or forgotten is the tracking and monitoring of how effective your measures are. So there's a lot of talk within companies about what KPIs do we create, but actually it's again those that the measures should benefit that will need to be involved in the tracking and in the monitoring and in telling you whether the measures have worked. So yeah, lots of opportunities along the due diligence cycle to improve engagement and improve impact.
Yeah, I love that it's relevant like across all these elements. Lee, please add something there.
I loved Madeleine's point about meaningful, the kind of distinction between stakeholder engagement and meaningful stakeholder engagement is that it's about materiality, it's about impact and concrete outcome, and the engagement is meaningful because it's the engagement that ensures that the outcome is meaningful. And for me, what links the two, what links engagement to that material outcome, is the process of listening. The fact that there needs to be, a simple but solid feedback loop, throughout the due diligence process. You risk assess, and that's about listening along your supply chain. You prevent and remediate, and again, to Madeleine's point, it's about checking with your stakeholders whether the interventions you have in mind are going to be effective in the field, and only they know. And again, with tracking, when it comes to checking whether those interventions have been effective, again, it's about listening. And when it comes to kind of the feedback loop with communication, I think the communication bits in terms of the kind of 6 stages of OECD, or the 4 steps defined by the UNGP, the UN guiding principles, that points about communicating both what you've found and what you've done about it and what effect that's had. That again is an extent of that kind of listening and feeding back about what's going on. So, and when it comes to that listening and feedback loop, I think companies need to find simple but effective ways of enabling that feedback that works both internally, but also works kind of at scale solidly externally along the supply chain.
So then, given what you're both saying, what would you say, Madeleine? We can start with you. Are the typical misperceptions then about meaningful stakeholder engagement?
There are a lot. I think it's still an area that is quite underexplored in practice by companies. So there are misperceptions about the why, the who, the when, the how, all of these elements. If you just think about who you should consult, for example, what we have often seen in the past is that companies respond to whoever screams the loudest. So it might be the more powerful stakeholders actually who have a very strong voice, who can maybe go to the press, who can create trouble for the company that were responded to the most. But what you then start to overlook is that you should actually engage those who might be most at risk, who might be affected, and those might not be the ones that can organize, that can kind of mobilize maybe the media. This is definitely something that we have seen, and that still needs to shift to really look at who needs to be consulted and not only respond to whoever screams the loudest. And then if you look at the how, for example, often what we see is that companies, they design something, it's finished, and then they want to engage maybe with a couple of NGOs to get their feedback. But in the end, the process is done for the company. They have, for example, developed the policy, it's done. And now they basically want someone to look at it and say, it's great, it covers all the relevant issues. But there's no real openness in that engagement process. There's no willingness to still change and adapt what you have designed. And the engagement comes too late. It comes at the end of the process, not maybe in the beginning, where you could still set the agenda, where you still could integrate new topics. So yeah, maybe these are some of the most important points we're seeing.
Those power dynamics are very interesting also in terms of the ability to organize and who can scream the loudest. Lee, do you have anything to add?
Actually, I think Madeleine has covered them all. I mean, the one kind of misconception I find a little bit unexpected is the fact that when stakeholders are considered in stakeholder engagement, it's often that brands assume that you're referring to their suppliers or strategic partners or intermediaries, the traders they work with quite closely, and that they don't recognize that meaningful stakeholder engagement, demands a much deeper reach. That you have to reach beyond your usual comfort zone, the usual tribe you're used to negotiating with, beyond the kind of commercial transactions and those parties you usually transact with, to use Madeleine's term that's so apt, to reach those affected. Business, human rights due diligence is all about impact. It's all about who's affected and not merely who the transacting partners are. So that's one of the kind of misperceptions I think is quite common.
So earlier, Madeleine, you noted that this whole idea of meaningful stakeholder engagement is actually clear in pretty much all of the elements of the OECD guidelines, from identifying risks and impacts and prevention and mitigation measures. But what would you say was some of the key components of meaningful stakeholder engagement?
When we developed the publication that was mentioned, we also interviewed a lot of partnerships that use stakeholder engagement. We interviewed companies that proactively use stakeholder engagement, and also some of the organizations, NGOs that are usually engaged by companies in these processes. And we defined 5 criteria that in our view make stakeholder engagement meaningful. And those are basically that engagement needs to be based on trust. So trust involves, for example, transparency, also having the time, having reliable, predictable behavior, and a real commitment to act. Those are some of the elements of trust. The second component is that engagement needs to be fit for purpose. So that also involves, not just engaging for the sake of engagement, but really, it needs to be designed to meet an objective that is agreed by all parties and that is clearly linked to the human rights due diligence strategy. The third element is that engagement needs to be rights-based to be meaningful. So the human rights principles really need to be your compass when you engage, and you need to be looking also at addressing power imbalances, for example, in the engagement process, and also sometimes decide not to engage when you will put people at risk by doing so. The fourth element is co-ownership, that relates both to the process but also to the outcomes of the engagement. You need open communication and knowledge sharing in the process, and maybe also cost sharing in that process. And the fifth and final element is about context sensitivity. So that means that you can't just roll out the same engagement approach across all your different risk areas or all different countries, but you really need to look at the social, economic, and cultural context of the location where you engage, and also do a proper stakeholder analysis so that you really don't forget anyone, and also include maybe those that have views that you do not share, the ones that are against the project, for example, and designing an approach that is really sensitive to the context. And what is maybe a bit overarching to all of this is that we felt that it needs a lot of skill to do that right. So developing kind of those engagement skills is definitely needed.
Yeah, I love that engagement kind of, makes sure the outcome is meaningful, but also, you focus on the process before the outcome itself. Lee, I actually want to direct this question to you. When it comes to the tools available to support meaningful stakeholder engagement, what would you suggest there, and what's available and the options?
Essentially, would love to go back to answer this question to the point about stakeholder engagement and listening. The tools that are available kind of to engage with stakeholders internally within your organization will be those tools you're already using, again, to just reiterate Madeleine's point from earlier about starting with what you've got, starting with your communications channels internally and using those for the feedback loop and the listening process, as you're designing the whole due diligence process, not as a final afterthought. But then externally, I think I have more value to add, when it comes to meaningful stakeholder engagement along your supply chain. Often companies believe that, the need across a complex supply chain means that the answer to that need is going to be incredibly complex and very expensive. And I think, thank the gods for technology and the nature of mobile communication in today's world. But stakeholders have mobile phones, and so you can use platforms like ours, and Wider does stakeholder engagement via mobile. And you can trigger these listening exercises in a cost-effective manner. And then, again, just to underline what Madeleine's already said about engaging not only in finding out, identifying and measuring the human rights risks and human rights impacts, and then, indeed engineering, what interventions you can make to address those risks, but in using the stakeholder engagement system like and Wider's to check with those stakeholders what constitutes an effective intervention. They, the human beings living the impacts of your supply chain and the impacts of whatever practices in a particular workplace, for example. So they would more likely than not have thought about ways to address that. And so they would be a very kind of mature, very capable audience to sense check interventions before you push play and invest huge amounts of funding in, trying to change the landscape when it comes to discrimination or recruitment fees and migrant labor in a particular setting, to check in with workers and say, would this work? Yes, no, don't know. And our experience, with mobile engagement in Wider has been you get, the data is incredibly valuable. You get very clear results with in terms of what workers believe will be effective and what they believe won't be effective. And I think the same applies later when it comes to even with remediation. When a sensitive issue is identified, and there are different options when it comes to remediating the problem or even remedying a kind of more broader problem. Again, check in with workers, and it's very feasible to do that using mobile engagement.
Thank you, Lee, for those options. So then finally, for companies who have not considered how to work with meaningful stakeholder engagement, where would you suggest they start, Madeleine?
I would suggest that they start to gain an understanding, to kind of develop a map of their landscape of stakeholders and potentially affected groups, so that they have a picture of basically who are we maybe already in touch with, where do we maybe already have contact points, and who might not be on our radar at the moment, and then maybe create room for an experiment to try it out on a very specific risk area, for example, and to really get the internal support to do so. I think that's important. I would only start actually engaging once I have the internal support, the resources that are needed, and also the support that we will deal with the results of this. We will, if the outcome is that we need to change, we are ready to change. We are ready to invest to really deal with the results. So that would be my recommendation, to invest in this internal engagement first, to offer you to give you then the space to really meaningfully engage.
Lee, you had given us like a wide range of options earlier on. Where would you suggest companies start?
Actually, I agree completely with Madeleine. When you're engaging in a listening exercise, you need to make sure that everyone's ready to hear what's said. So without the necessary internal buy-in, stakeholder engagement can be utterly meaningless, and irresponsible and misleading, because of course the stakeholders engage with the expectation that they'll be heard and something will happen. But then if there isn't internal buy-in, then it falls on deaf ears and it's shelved, and stakeholders become cynical about future engagement. So completely with Madeleine. Frankly, I would start with sustainable links and Madeleine's five components. That's where I would start. I would start with a kind of clear recipe for stakeholder engagement. And this framework that they've developed just makes a whole lot of sense.
Yeah, I love that about being aware of the capacity to act, because then it builds trust in the monitoring systems, and it drives social impact towards a global vision of more sustainable supply chains. So I think we can end it there. You've landed it both beautifully. Madeleine, thank you once again for sharing your insights with us. Honestly, your passion for human rights and environmental justice, yourself and Gwen, is really clear. And we have already seen, in the last almost 2 years, the impact of sustainable links in the landscape. And since our first conversation last year. So for our listeners also, if you would like to access the support on meeting these due diligence requirements, please do get in touch with Sustainable Links or ourselves, as Lee did mention. You will find the contact details linked in the notes of this podcast. And as mentioned previously as well, we do work with Madeleine and a host of other partners who have a wealth of experience in these matters. So if we can support you with getting the most out of human rights due diligence, both in terms of meeting the legal requirements and good practice, please do get in touch. And thank you to the both of you. That's it from us today. Thank you so much for joining us. Be sure to follow us on LinkedIn to keep up to date with all things NWIDER, and look out for our next installment. Goodbye.